All right, you're good to go, Carlette.
Join me in welcoming Eric Ensley. He is the curator of rare books and maps and special collections and archives at the University of Iowa. He holds a PhD in English, focusing on medieval studies from Yale University, and an MLS from the University of North Carolina. Eric's efforts are often focused on making early books available to a broad audience, from undergraduates and members of the local community to scholars. His exhibition he curated with book artist Emily Martin, Making the Book, Past and Present, is currently on display in the first floor gallery of Main Library. He is also the chief editor of the Bibliographical Society of America's BibSite project, which has grown to become the largest free repository of bibliographical information and book historical information online. I think I
Thank
covered it
you. Yeah, I think you got it. Thank you, Carlette, and thank you, Maddie, so much for having me here today to talk about some of these nerdy but really exciting subjects. Really a great collaboration we have here on campus. And it sounds like everybody can hear me okay. Nobody's looking befuddled, so that's good. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about medieval fragments, some early modern fragments too. If you don't know what those are yet, don't worry. We're going to go over them and tell you what our collaborative project did and where it's going and some of the cool stuff that's come out of it. So without further ado, I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint that I have going here. Can everybody see that okay? Very good. Excellent. All right. So today we're going to have a talk called A Library Scavenger Hunt for Medieval Fragments, the Ithaca project. Ithaca is an acronym we came up with. Don't worry, it's a lot. It's a mouthful. I'll tell you exactly what it means here in just one second. But thank you for joining me today. I look forward to hearing your questions at the end. If I can get, yeah. So we're going to start with an introduction to the project and the team and how all of this came to be on Iowa's campus. It's kind of got a long history that started even before I arrived here. So I've been here 3 years and 2 months now, and this started a little bit before then. And yeah, I can't believe it's been 3 years either. It's wild. So to start with, who we are ISICA, IISICCA, which stands for the Iowa Initiative for Scientific Imaging and Conservation of Cultural Artifacts. It's a pretty large group, started with around 15 to 20 people. People fall off and come on from time to time, depending on their workload in their individual departments. But we're really a broadly stationed group of people on campus. So there's art historians, members of the classics department, engineering, various kinds of engineering, computer science, computer engineering, also biological engineering. There's the Iowa Center for the Book, the Small Animal Imaging Corps, which is the veterinarian people who work on small animals with like CT scanners and things like that. And what we all kind of came together over is what's called non-destructive enhanced imaging. And non-destructive enhanced imaging is basically this field of book history and basically material history more broadly that looks at objects and says, what can we get out of them without damaging them? So in the most basic level of this is done in here with our preservation department when we take images and put them online, like in the Iowa Digital Library. But there are other steps that we can take. There's x-rays, there's thermographs, there's different ways of going about this. And so this is kind of a big group of people that are interested broadly in that topic and how it might speak to what they're doing. So there are members from the Stanley, and we're the representatives from the libraries in this project. What do we mean by non-destructive imaging is the next thing. Non-destructive imaging is basically when we think about material objects that are in our collections, whether it's the Stanley or here at the libraries, one of the first things that we want to do is kind of like the physician's oath. We don't want to do any harm to the objects when we're looking at them. Sometimes that's easier said than done, especially if the objects what they have inside of them or what we want to see is deep within the covers or the spines of the books or even within a statue. So certain votive statues in the Stanley Museum actually hold various objects within them, like prayer rolls and things like that. So to see inside of these objects, we don't want to do any damage. And that's taken a long history, hundreds of years to figure out how do we get inside them without doing the sort of damage. And we're providing one of the answers to this question of how do we do that with this group and this project that we've been working on. Where did we get started? So this goes back to the Mellon Sawyer grant that was on campus a few years ago through the Religious Studies Department. Paul Dilley did quite a bit for spearheading that. He's been working on the Herculaneum rolls that you might have seen in the news lately as being opened up and we can start to read them again. And he's been working heavily on that project. He's also a part of Ithaca and has helped with our project too. And directly where we come from after the Mellon Sawyer grant was the More Than Meets the Eye conference that took place in March of 2020 in the libraries. That brought together a group of people who are interested in imaging technologies and answering the kind of questions that I brought up before. And it started with a small Ethiopic talisman in our collections here in Special Collections. And what this was is a little object that was coated in leather, sewn up so you couldn't see inside of it. And the question is, what was inside of this Ethiopic codex that was covered with leather that we couldn't open up without damaging it? So using some basic scanning technologies, XRF scanning, they were able to look inside of this object and discover that it was actually a small set of gospels that were bound up in this Ethiopic talisman that's in our collection. So that kind of started that in 2020 with the More Than Meets the Eye project. And then I arrived at the end of 2020, and I've consistently been interested in medieval fragments. And so let's talk about medieval fragments a little bit. All right, so what is a fragment? Well, basically books fall apart. We all know this to be true. We have books on our own shelves that are probably falling apart, or maybe books that we don't read anymore. And going back hundreds of years, this was still the case in the later Middle Ages and the early modern period as well. So basically books were valuable objects, yes, but at a certain point, you couldn't read the handwriting anymore. In the early print period, so after 1450s in Europe, in the 1500s especially, you didn't really read your medieval manuscripts anymore because they're hard to read. Look at that handwriting on this screen. It's hard for us to read today. And actually, Dante in the early 1300s says, this handwriting's really hard to read. We should change this in one of the texts that he writes. So basically, what happens is, to reinforce the structure of newly printed books, especially in the 1500s, people start shredding those medieval manuscripts because they're made of parchment, which is animal skin, and it's a good reinforcing structure. You can see here on these two images that it's been used to cover the spine, which protects the spine. And if you can imagine, this book would have probably been covered with a leather or some other covering over the top of these medieval fragments. But basically, they're just there to help buttress the book. In England, with the monasteries were disillusioned in the 1530s, and basically you had tons of medieval manuscripts floating around that could be bought up, shredded, and put into different objects. Some were even used to stuff furniture. Basically, it's a different relationship to medieval manuscripts than we have today. Now, these fragments, how often did they occur in a book is a question that might be coming to mind right now. So one estimate says that in the 15 and 1600s, as many as 1 in 6 books in our collections, any collection across the world, will have a medieval fragment somewhere in it. So this is kind of an interesting thing because suddenly we have way more pieces of the Middle Ages in our books than we suspect we do, even in books going up to the 17 and 1800s is what we found. Where do we find these in books typically then? Well, here we have two really good examples. We have ones that are covering the spine label here. So you can see, I'm just going to put my cursor here. So basically over the spine between the cords, that's a really common place to find these medieval binding fragments. Also on the covers, as you see here, they were often used there. Other places are actually deep down inside of the gutter of the book. So the crease of the pages down in the middle, and we can't always see them really well. So you can sometimes see medievalists in research rooms or in the research area of libraries really peering down into the book and trying to spread it apart as much as they can, to the point that sometimes you have to be like, sir, can you please stop? Please, that's a little much, okay? Um, but that's where we're stepping in with this kind of research. The sort of texts that you might find on these fragments are ones you might expect from the Middle Ages. Sometimes there are Bibles, there are commentaries on different texts, but sometimes something really cool will come along. And this is part of the reason that we do some of this. So I'm going to just briefly mention two examples that are really interesting in the last few years. The left one that we have here is a medieval fragment in an early modern printed book. And it's been worn away. You can see it's not been a really well-loved piece of parchment. But what it contains is actually a part of the King Arthur legend considering Merlin that we didn't have before. This is not an attested story, but it was found on this binding fragment by a professor while just doing research at the University of Bristol. So that's an incredible discovery to make, a new story of Merlin that goes into the kind of King Arthur cycle. On the right-hand side is an even, I think, kind of cooler story. There is a medieval poem that comes up. The only reason that we knew of it was because other stories referenced it, quoted from it, called The Siege of Orange. Now, it actually got to the point where scholars were beginning to think maybe this poem actually didn't exist, and it was kind of just a made-up cultural point that got brought into the culture. But then a graduate student, Tamara Atkins, in the Bodleian, while doing research in the Bodleian, called up a medieval manuscript and started looking at this little fragment you see here. And she figured out, wait, this I've seen this quoted before. This is the Siege of Orange. So this is actually the only piece of the Siege of Orange that has ever been found before. And this happens quite often with medieval manuscripts. If you've ever heard of Gawain and the Green Knight, that's only in a single manuscript in the British Library. Same for Beowulf, only in a single manuscript. So finding and recovering these fragments can actually add to our literary and cultural heritage and help broaden our understanding of literature or texts from the medieval period. Some other reasons that we might think about why these medieval fragments matter. Well, first off, one of the really cool things I like to tell people who are librarians at small liberal arts colleges and community colleges, if you have books from the 15, 16, or 1700s, you might say, oh, I don't have any medieval manuscripts in my collection. You know, that's for larger universities. I bet you do. They're probably just hiding in the gutter, hiding on the spines. And if you start to look through them, if you have 1 in 6, those are good odds that you're going to find something. And I think that's pretty exciting. Um, of course, as I just said, we can find new or lost texts. That's another good reason to look for these. Um, and it's also kind of a way to grow our understanding of textual technologies from this period. So different kinds of handwriting, what sort of texts were circulated, and even the fragments of themselves. So what kinds of texts were broken down and used as binding fragments, as we're talking about today. Okay. So let's talk about recovering those binding fragments and what the field sort of looked like before we were really stepping into the fray on this. So the first thing I'll say is that there's been research done on this before our work. For about 40, 50 years now, people have really talked more and more about binding fragments and how we can get at the text they contain. And so there's been a couple of different forays into trying to do this. One of the most famous is this scholar named Eric Quackle, whose XRF machine you can see here. It's a kind of X-ray machine that are sometimes housed in cultural institutions like libraries and museums. They're specially built, they're expensive, and they take a long time to get a good scan of what's underneath the covers of a book. So in these two images, you see on the left the book being scanned, and on the right, you see the book that was scanned, and then on the far right, you see what came through on the X-ray. And this looks great. If we zoom in on this, I could probably read this for you and translate it for you, and it's showing the binding fragment that's underneath the cover of this book. The problem is, as I said, it's super expensive. Getting one of these set up takes a large number of grants. We're talking millions of dollars to get this to get going. The second thing is that a good scan like this takes 4 to 8 hours per book. So you have to leave that in front of the scanner for 4 to 8 hours. And as Giselle Simone will tell you, we don't have good research on what sort of damage long-term radiation exposure can do to parchment, which is a kind of animal skin. So there's a kind of a lingering question there. You would not want to go into an X-ray scanner for 4 to 6 hours, which makes me sometimes think probably don't want to put a organic object in front of it either. Um, so the other way that you might go about doing this, there's also infrared, which is another technology where you will put a book in front of a set of halogen lamps. Those halogen lamps will flash, give off enough heat to heat up the book a couple of degrees. And actually, what's inside of the fragments will, the heat comes off at different temperatures, which means you can read those different temperatures coming off and see what's underneath the cover sometimes. Problem with that, as you can probably tell by my face, we don't like to heat up books very suddenly. It can do some damage to the book. And it's also the case that this heat doesn't penetrate deep into the book. So we're definitely not seeing everything when we do this kind of infrared scanning as well. Also, it's another expensive technology. Okay, I'm gonna keep on going here. So let's talk about what our intervention at the University of Iowa has been. So first, to start that, I'm going to do a little short thing about what are these objects made out of. So on this medieval fragment you can see from our collection, we have a pretty typical substrate or base. It's parchment, so animal skin of some kind that's been written on, which is common for the Middle Ages up until the advent of paper really coming in the 13 and 1400s. And then you see different colors of writing on this, right? So there are different kinds of inks from the medieval period. Two main types. There's something called lampblack, which is where you would take the carbon off of a candle by putting a piece of metal over a candle. You capture the soot, you scrape it off into a binder, some sort of gum, and that's how you make ink. The more common form is what's called oak gall ink, which is even weirder. If you've ever been walking down Summit Street and you've seen an oak tree, for example, one of the big ones, and they have those big protuberances on them, those are called oak galls. And they're made by a wasp laying an egg on the tree, and the tree grows the ball around the wasp egg to help protect itself. Those things are full of tannins, and a medieval monk at some point figured out that you could crack these open, powder them down, put them into wine, and when you cook them, you get an ink out of it that can be bound into a gum. Right. This means that it's sort of an organic compound itself and ends up being kind of a useful thing to put into a scanner that can read organic compounds. More on that in a second. It matters for what we're going to be doing here. So what our intervention was, after the More Than Meets the Eye conference, Eric Hoffman, who is a professor in the Department of Radiology over at the hospitals, heard about what we were doing through some of the people who attended, and he said, well, wait, why aren't you doing this with CT scanners? And that we were interested in this. And we said, well, it had been tried many, many years ago with CT scanners and they didn't get anything. And he told us, well, CT scanning technology has gotten a lot better over the years. Maybe we should try this again. And so we applied for a small jump-starting grant through the Office of the Provost, and were able to buy some time on the scanner over at the hospitals that you see in this photo. It's a very basic CT scanner that's used for medical research in the basement of the hospital. It didn't cost all that much money to buy a couple of hours on it to do some scanning. And we basically were able to take some books from our collection over to make this happen. Now, there's a lot of work that went into that. I said it in a few sentences, but of course, this had to involve various members of the team. So Giselle Simone, of course, did a lot of work in packing these books and getting them over to the hospitals for us. And this also took place during COVID. So we had to go through the underground tunnels through the library or through the hospital, and poor Giselle had to drag these books for almost a mile, I think. So we really appreciate the effort she put into that. And then, of course, we had to have the buy-in of members of the radiology department and others too. So we are also very fortunate here at Special Collections to have a really great collection of early books, early printed books especially. And within that, there was one book that stood out immediately to me when I arrived here on campus. And that is this really beautiful 3-volume set of Conrad Gessner's Historia Animalium. It's one of the first printed encyclopedias in the world, which is really cool in and of itself. But our copy is even cooler because it had this damage present in it. So one of the volumes you can see has been splayed open here with the cover pulled back, and it reveals a couple of medieval fragments along the spine here. Those are really early medieval fragments, probably from the 11th century, based on the handwriting. So we're talking 500 years later in this printed book, these fragments from about 1050, 1075 are showing up being used to buttress the binding of the book. Now, what this meant for us is if we can pull back the cover on this one without damaging the book because it's already open, and if you look, those 3 volumes, they look like they were bound at the same place, which would have been the place the fragments would have been shredded and put onto the book. That means we had a control. We can close this binding, put it, and we know what it says already, put it into the scanner and see if the CT scanner is revealing everything on that page, some of it or none of it. And then we have 2 books that we can't open the binding on, and we can try to see if we can read through those without knowing what's underneath them. It's kind of a ready-made science project for us with the fragments, and we were just very fortunate to have these already here. So what we ended up doing after we got these books over here, we put them into the scanner, and the scan only takes about 30 seconds. So remember previously I had said that we were talking 4 to 6 hours of high radiation counts being pumped into a book trying to get the text out of them. Our scans are on a medical grade CT scanner, so no more than a human body would receive radiation in a CT scan. And then it takes only 30 seconds of time, and we could load up the full gantry with as many books as we wanted, is what Dr. Hoffman told us. So here's the results we got from just putting this in. And I was standing there with Catherine Tackow, Professor Emerita of the History Department, as these scans came up on screen. And we were saying, oh, I can read this in the booth in the hospital as they were coming up on screen, which is this really incredible moment. And you can see that there's some kind of interesting stuff happening in these results we got. So you can see on the right-hand lower image over here that some of the ink is showing up, but not all of the ink. We're getting some things that are really brightly attenuating, or attenuating in jargon here means just to show up quite well, so much so that we could read. And over here on another one, we can see that we're getting letters that may not have been present on one side of the fragment, because remember, fragments are 2-sided. So this was kind of a heartening result for us. It's good news because with a CT scanner, we were able to make some things appear that were underneath the covers. But it really showed up well when we started to think of, started to look at the books that we could not open by pulling back that cover. And here's what happened with those. So in order to analyze these scans, Honghai Zhang, who is a computer engineer on campus, actually took the program that is used for CT scanners to look at the human eye. The human eye is curved, just like a book spine. And so when a CT scanner takes a CT scan of your eyeball, what it does, it actually takes those layers as it does the scans and flattens them out into a plane so that they can look like a normal image. And that's exactly what he did with our images from this CT scan. He took the different layers of the spine because it's a little curved, splayed them out, and was able to make this text legible. And this was kind of one of the pièces de résistance of our research, where you can see on this fragment, this has been hidden for 500 years. We were able to read a little bit of the Latin text that was present on this page, and it says, "Incip v SCIMARINIEPI." Medieval Latin's heavily abbreviated, but Catherine Tackow and I immediately recognized this as Incipit Vita Sancti Martini Episcopi. Here begins the life of Saint Martin the Bishop. So not only were we able to read this, we also got the start of a story from a book. So it's basically the saint's life of Saint Martin that appeared in this fragment that we have. Really, really exciting stuff to be able to pull out, especially with a 30 to 45 second scan. Now, why would we want to do this, and what do we hope to get out of it? I'm going to pop over to the next slide here. Well, the first thing that we wanted to do was not every library can have an XRF scanner like the one that takes 4 to 8 hours. They're expensive. We probably couldn't even afford one on the kind of budget that we have here unless we got some major grants. What we were hoping to do is find a means of universities being able to quickly find out if they have medieval fragments in their collection. We could not read everything, but we could read something, and it allows us to know which books probably need to be investigated more closely, say with an XRF scanner. Many universities have access to CT scanners, and if you can scan, 100 books in less than an hour, that's not too much money. It can be less than $1,000 to be able to find out what sort of medieval fragments you might have. So basically, we see this as a way of opening up fragment searches to other institutions, and not just ones that are very wealthy and able to do that kind of work. So what are the next chapters for our project? Well, some of them are already happening. Recently, John Martin Rare Book Room has joined us, offering some books for the next scanning session that took place. And of course, the John Martin Rare Book Room is a fabulous collection of early modern and later medical texts. And Damien Eric, their curator, took a good amount of time to go through and figure out what books might be best to search for fragments in. So he joined our team in looking for medieval fragments in his collection, and I'll show you what some of these looked like. So these are some of the fragments that he had found hiding in some of his books that we wanted to test. The one on the upper left was really fascinating because, as I was telling you, there are different kinds of inks. This book actually has some green ink in a medieval fragment. Now, green is made of a copper substrate. So basically, it's oxidized copper, as you would find on pennies that would be put into a pigment. And we weren't sure if that would show up on a CT scanner. So that was a really great way to test if this scanner was able to pick up green pigments, red pigments, and some black pigments as well. So he gracefully brought this over to us, and we were able to bring it up with the next set of scanning. And a few months ago, we were actually able to go over to the hospital, and we had been waiting for several months because the hospital got a brand new CT scanner, one that was delivered this past year, state of the art. It's called a photon counting CT scanner. So basically, CT scanners prior to this have been analog, which means that the CT scanner gathers the data in an analog way and it converts it into digital data, which then goes to your computer screen. And that conversion actually makes the images worse. Whereas the photon counting scanner basically counts the photons as they're coming off of the CT mechanism and makes for a completely digital image, and it makes for a much clearer image. Now, this is a CT scanner that's actually for medical use in the hospital. So it has patients on it, which means that we couldn't use it during the normal hospital day because, people actually need treatment, and the books are not as important as people. So finally, we were able, with Dr. Hoffman's assistance, to get a couple of hours with this scanner in the off time. And we were able to take over our books again to see what would show up on a brand new CT scanner and to see if the technology had improved at all. You can see our little collection of books lined up here, some from the John Martin Rare Book Room too, going to get their treatment. Okay. Now, I will also mention before I change over to this next slide that in the meanwhile, for our first set of results, we actually wrote a group paper for this that got picked up, was put into the peer-reviewed journal Heritage Science, which is really exciting because it's one of the top journals that uses science alongside cultural heritage objects. So our research appeared in that. And then subsequently, it was picked up by the New York Times in May of last year. I believe the article was called "A Visit to the Hospital Reveals Medieval Fragments," which is really cool. And then after that, Library Journal picked it up as well. So it was starting to get some press. And I think these images of books being sent into a human CT scanner kind of had something to do with this. All right. So after this, and once we had secured another grant and we began doing the scanning with the photon counting scanner, you can see these are the results of the same book with the photon counting scanner, and wildly better. You can see how much sharper and cleaner these images are. You can actually see where there are some imperfections in the fragment, the structure of the fragment too, that were blocking out some of the letters. And we are starting to see letters that we had not seen before showing up with the photon counting system. So basically, Dr. Hoffman was able to get this to work, and we're seeing some progress. And this is kind of where we're at right now in terms of the scanning side of things. We are analyzing the data. We are looking at these images to see what came through, and we're figuring out what our next steps are in terms of publicizing this research and seeing if we want to take this to a larger audience and get other institutions on board with basically doing a survey of their medieval fragments in their collections to see if our premise that if you make this cheaper, we might be able to find out more actually will pay dividends is where we're at right now. Okay, so going to wrap things up here with some what's next for us and some of the takeaways from this experience. What have we learned over the course of doing this? Because I think one of the more interesting things about this project was that it was a collaborative project across campus where the library played kind of the unifying cohesive glue for the project. We were the place everybody sort of came together. It started with the More Than Meets the Eye conference. And we are also sort of taking on a lot of the research and writing duties for this, which I thought was pretty exciting. Okay, so takeaways. First off, the grant seeking is imperative. And I think that was one of the first challenges that we had with doing this project. You have to find money somewhere. We're very fortunate at the University of Iowa that we have jumpstarting grants, we have community organization grants. There's money floating around campus for a lot of groups able to start these sort of collaborative projects. One of the bigger challenges, though, is that the humanities libraries and sciences function very differently on grants. Sciences are always going to be looking towards what is the next grant to help fuel their lab, which meant that there was a high imperative for the sciences to keep publishing, to keep doing experimentation, because that's what keeps them afloat, is the constant funneling of grant money. Whereas it functions a little differently for humanities departments where it's not so dire that your lab will shut down if you don't get more and more grants. I feel like there was a sort of breakneck pace for the sciences, whereas trying to communicate how humanities and libraries function a little bit differently on grant schedules and cycles, and about what are the duties of different organizations within the university. Like we can't constantly be doing research with libraries, in that we have to take care of the library and our patrons and users. Second thing I would say is building on strong foundations. So I think it's really great that we kind of have this through line at University of Iowa of book history becoming larger and larger. We have the Center for the Book, of course. We have a lot of scholars interested in the history of the book across campus. And it started slowly with the Mellon Sawyer grant, and then we're at the point now where we are generally being recognized as one of the stronger institutions in the United States interested in book history as a field, and seeing how that sort of can be a unifying force for different people on campus, I think has been a very positive experience and helps drive actually a lot of that grant seeking that I talked about in the first point. We make sense to a lot of grant writers and the people who judge grants that we would be a good place to do this sort of research. Third thing I want to say is the welcoming of new faces and new ideas. I think it was really one of the best things I've seen on campus here that we have welcomed new people into this group who are interested throughout it. Damien is a great example of that when Damien said, oh, hey, I've seen some fragments. It would be really cool to see some of these. And it's like, yeah, come on, let's do this. Let's get this onto the grant schedule and get these books scanned. Same for myself. I arrived here in December after the More Than Meets the Eye conference, but I felt welcomed into this group enough that I was shared an interesting book in the collection, which became the subject of this research, and that ended up getting us into the New York Times, which really great. So I think there's a real value in going out and welcoming the newest faces in the libraries and across campus, and figuring out where they might fit into this sort of research and outreach puzzle that we have going at University of Iowa. And then one of the biggest things is respecting the expertise of colleagues. I don't think any project like this could work if there wasn't a sort of space in which we could talk through what is the knowledge base for each of the group of people who are contributing. For this grant and for this project, we had Catherine Tackow, history professor, myself, a librarian and curator, but we also had radiologists, we had computer engineers, we had different people who are contributing. And that will bring up challenges to any organization. For us, one of those was the sort of jargon that each group uses. We use different terms in different ways, and establishing at the outset a shared vocabulary and a space where we feel comfortable asking each other questions. One of the most exciting things about this group was that it was totally normal to say, I don't understand what you're talking about. Could you explain this simply to me? And the scientists actually led with that. They're great about being like, I don't understand that word. You just use, tell me what it means. And what a great way to go about our work, right? Because that lets other people show their expertise at the same time as we're listening and learning from each other. So big takeaway for that one. And then the last point, tie it into broader interests. This is some really deep scientific stuff, talking about energy values and wavelengths and things like that. But it's also really cool. Every time that I show this book to students, they get very excited. Actually, the book is that we use for the scanning session is right now in the exhibition downstairs. And when I was giving one of the gallery tours, towards the end, I pointed out that this is what we've been doing with this book and taking it over to the hospitals. And one of the frat guys, actually, I heard him audibly say, "Oh, wow, that's really cool," And I was just like, "Yes, okay, that's the kind of outreach that I want to see. I want to see people who would not normally be interested in this sort of thing, seeing it as a topic that we're doing here at University of Iowa. We have the expertise to support, and who knows, maybe he'll be up in special collections in a few weeks because of that. You never know." So basically, not just pigeonholing ourselves into deep scientific research, but thinking who might be interested in this? How can we make this sound interesting to other people? And I think that's one of the cool things we do here at University of Iowa Libraries. So thank you for joining me today, and I can't wait to answer some of your questions.
All right, cool. I'm going to stop the recording before I lose my mind over the ink types. Hold on.